Good morning, everybody. Season premiere of our Rip from the Headlines is we're going to start tackling a new season of all of the latest and greatest topics from a Jewish perspective. As always, suggestions welcome, and I appreciate those that were sent already. There are sources in the chat for those who'd like to follow along. And we're coming on the Jewish calendar towards the end of the year 5782, which in Israel was a Shemitah year. And Shemitah came up in some classes and speeches over the last year. It's especially relevant in Israel. It can be relevant outside of Israel if there is Israeli produce. Essentially, Shemitah is the sabbatical year, and the land cannot be worked. And that's very difficult for an agricultural society. I still remember, back in my gap year era, spent 2 years post-high school studying in yeshiva. One of the programs that we went to was a seminar from the Eish HaTorah organization, where they have a number of presentations trying to show the relevance or the proving the Torah, the proofs. I think it's called the Discovery Seminar. I don't know if they still have it today or what it is today. So one of the sessions talked about the idea that the fact that Shemitah is in the Torah must be one of the proofs that the Torah is not just a man-made document. It must have a certain divine origin. And the way the presenter put it, that how would an agricultural society allow a sabbatical year to remain in its text and its religious doctrine unless it had a divine origin, right? Along the lines of if the Torah was composed by committee and had to be approved by the people, well, the people would have taken it out if it wasn't helpful to them. And so therefore the fact that the Shemitah year remained, did not end up on the cutting room floor and instead was something that has been passed on and was canonized, hints to a divine imprint on the text. It's one of the examples that's given. Take it or leave it as you will, but Shemitah is a unique commandment. It is a difficult commandment. It's one that the Jewish nation violated often. The prophets talk about the destruction of the first temple coming in the aftermath of a number of sins of the Jewish nation. Some of them were social sins, some of them were religious sins, idolatry, and some were some of the criticism was directed at the fact that they were not observing Shemitah. The Shemitah is about the land and our relationship with the land, and the idea that it presents a certain element of faith, that God is in charge, and even without working the land, there will be sustenance. Right? Very famously, the Torah asks, what are you going to eat? Right? Because you're not going to be planting it all in the seventh year, and it'll take a whole other year for things to grow. So essentially, your products of the sixth year have to last you for 3 years. So there's an element of faith there. That's how it's presented. You could also, of course, imagine that for long periods of our history, it was not relevant because Jews were not there, and it's become more relevant in the last 120, 130 years or so as Jews have started returning and working the land. One of the other headlines recently was the 125th anniversary of the First Zionist Congress, right in Basel, Switzerland. There had been some settlement in the land even before that, but so Shemitah was something that was on the agenda, and most of the time we talk about it as it pertains to agriculture. You can't work the land, so how do you work the land? How does farming continue? And we've spoken about and maybe heard about the idea of the heter mechira, the selling of the land, which is similar to the idea that we sell our chametz, right? Over Pesach, we may have chametz in our homes, and we don't want it to belong to us, so we sell it, and it might be in our homes, but it doesn't belong to us, and afterwards we take possession of it again. And a similar idea, you have the heter mechira, the land is sold, so therefore it's only Jewish land which cannot be worked. This land is sold after the year, it returns back to Jewish ownership. That you may have seen articles, I know I spoke about one, not in the class, but the idea that there are efforts now to raise funds to support farmers who are taking the year off in full adherence to the biblical mandate. So that's another major topic with regards to Shemitah. The Shemitah will have some ramifications for us here in the diaspora with those of us who like to get our esrogim on Sukkot from Israel, and how that impacted the esrog crop. For those who will be purchasing it, there are certain instructions and details that will relate to that. But the Heter Mechira really was something that was a concern a year ago as the Shemitah year arrived. There is another element of Shemitah, and that is what's called the idea that there's a Shemitah with regards to canceling of the loans. And the loans are canceled. And basically, if someone, if a Jew owes another Jew money, officially, the Torah says that the loan is canceled with the Shemitah year. A certain idea of freedom, this idea of things should return to its original owners. It's kind of almost like a cleanse, if you will. And the Torah talks about the loan being canceled. Which, many of us, this is irrelevant because we don't really lend out a lot of money, but it could be relevant for those, it's certainly relevant to people who lend out more money, certainly relevant to those who borrow a lot of money. And so the question is, what happens to those loans? And we're going to learn there's something that Hillel established, something called the Prozbul. That's why our class is entitled "As Shemitah Ends, Preparing the Prozbul." The Shemitah year, at its conclusion, cancels out all loans. Hillel had an innovation to try and circumvent this canceling, and we'll see a little bit of the reason why. And like the Shemitah in general, is this something that is still relevant? Is this something that has gone the way of the past? How did Hillel come up with this? There's certain meta ideas within Jewish law that will emerge from it, and so you may see or you may encounter in your congregational emails or read about it in the Jewish press. This idea of preparing the Prozbul. Every 7 years, right before Rosh Hashanah, there's a Prozbul prepared. So what is that? Why is that? How is that? Should there be that? That is going to be what we talk about today. Another aspect or a facet of the Shemitah sabbatical year conversation. So with that, we're going to turn towards the sources. We start with the Mishnah in Shvi'it. Shvi'it is the 7th. That's the tractate dealing with Shemitah. So source number 1, the sabbatical year cancels a debt written in a document or one not written in a document. All right, sabbatical year cancels debts. A loan secured by a Prozbul is not canceled. But if you have this Prozbul, and the Prozbul is a Greek word, this was one of the things enacted by Hillel the Elder. For when he observed people refraining from lending to one another and thus transgressing what is written in the Torah, beware lest you harbor the base thought. The 7th year, the year of remission, is approaching, so that you are mean to your needy kinsman to give him nothing. Right? You're going to say, okay, if the 7th year is going to cancel the loans, I'm not going to lend anybody any money because I'm not going to get repaid. Hillel enacted the Prozbul so that people would not fall victim to that sentiment, which is of course natural because who wants to lose money? And so therefore, Hillel enacted the Prozbul. What's the formula? Right? I turn over to you, so-and-so judges of such and such a place, that any debt that I may have outstanding, I shall collect it whenever I desire, and the judges sign below or the witnesses. So essentially what Hillel did, he created this Prozbul, this document. I still remember in 9th grade, when we were studying the tractate of Gittin, which has a lot of the Talmudic discussion about the Prozbul. I still remember very clearly. It's based on this, the etymology has something to do with the words Prozbuli buti, and echoing in my head are my 9th grade Rebbe at MTA going, Prozbuli buti, Prozbuli buti. Some of these things are imprinted with regards to Prozbul in my educational history. But essentially, what was the mechanism involved? So the Torah says that a person is not, loans are canceled. Someone who lends someone else money, the loan is canceled, the borrower does not have to repay the lender. What Hillel enacted was that if I lend someone money, I'm transferring that loan to the Beit Din, to the rabbinical court. So the borrower no longer owes me money, the borrower owes the rabbinical court money. Well, the Torah says that loans between borrowers and lenders are canceled by the sabbatical year, not loans between borrowers and the courts. And therefore, since the court is now the holder of that note, the loan is not canceled. you may say that it seems to be against the spirit of the whole law. Correct, but Hillel recognized that following the law in its entirety would mean people wouldn't lend people in need money. What's worse? So therefore, he took the expression in the prohibition literally. You can't. The loans are canceled. Loans between individuals are canceled. The loans from a borrower to the Beit Din are not canceled. So if you transfer the loan to the Beit Din, it can still be collected, and then there's kind of an agreement between the Beit Din and the lender that the lender will get the money back. You know, kind of. It's not like selling the land or selling the chametz, but it's kind of transferring the loan, but the money still ends up where it's in the hands of the lender as is intended. Shemitah is supposed to cancel it. Instead, the loan can continue as usual, as long as the private lender, the individual, transfers the loan into the hands of the Beit Din. As the Mishnah says at the end, what's the formula? I turn over the loan, and therefore the Shemitah year, the sabbatical year, will not cancel that loan, because the sabbatical year only cancels loans between lenders and borrowers, not borrowers and Beit Din. There is an analogous situation that it has been established in Israel during the Shemitah year, which is called Otzar Bezdin. Anyone who has been to Israel during this past year may have experienced in previous Shemitah sabbatical years. There are certain terms that are used, because if technically there's nothing, you're not allowed to, the land must lie fallow, then what kind of produce are people eating? So sometimes people are careful to only eat imported produce in the sabbatical year. Then, as we mentioned, there's the heter mechira. Many farmers, remember, the Israeli agricultural industry is a multi-billion-dollar endeavor. You're not able to just shut it down for a year. And so the heter mechira, selling of the land, is the dominant approach to addressing the complications of the sabbatical year. So most people, it's business as usual, because the heter mechira is enacted, and that is considered viable according to Jewish law, according to many authorities, certainly in cases of need, and that's how most people approach it. Those who are strict will only eat imported produce, or there's a kind of a third way, and that's called Otzar Beit Din. The Beit Din is considered the owner of everything. And so essentially, any of the work that's taking place is not from the place of the private individual, just taking place on behalf of the rabbis. And therefore, you're allowed to pay the costs. Officially, the idea is that when you're not paying the owner of the field, and you're not paying the workers, you're covering everybody's costs. So in theory, things should be less expensive. Of course, practically speaking, that's never how it works. So yeah, I got the inflation in now. So you have the idea of another mechanism, but that too, that there's a certain sense that when if you remove the produce or the land out of the private ownership into the realm of Beit Din, you kind of sidestep the full enforcement of Shemitah. Same thing over here. Take the loan away from the lender and put it to the Beit Din, and then someone is allowed to collect. The Beit Din can collect, and there's an agreement that the Beit Din will then transfer the funds back to the lender. Again, it is a bit of a workaround, and that was enacted by Hillel, but he thought that in this case, the workaround was necessary, because otherwise people in need did not have access to the funds, because no one would lend anybody else any money. And that's how they enacted this Prozbul. So that's the establishment, that's the concept of the Prozbul. It was enacted, the Mishnah presents it, and then we're going to see that even in Talmudic times, this wasn't something that was necessarily, not everyone was so comfortable with this. Some of you may be thinking, hey, that's a shortcut. Some of you may be thinking it's a legal fiction, right? There are a number of things that we have in Jewish law that may seem like this, and maybe some of them are, but we're going to see that just because Hillel presented it as an enactment doesn't necessarily mean it's something that's there for the ages and will last forever. Just any questions or reactions to the presentation of this idea? A little bit of a longer introduction with regards to Shemitah, but happy to clarify as needed.
Rabbi Howard, I was in a lending business 40 years, so I have some familiarity with this.
Mm-hmm.
If you lend to a corporation, is that exempt from this rule to begin with? That's number one. And number two, if the lender doesn't care, he's a Jew, but he's not observant, is the borrower have any liability if the lender doesn't transfer the loan? He's not the lender. Those are my two comments.
So, in general, we're going to see this unfold. So I think that your second issue in terms of liability, I think we'll address it towards the end. Also, this is really about loans between private individuals. Similar to the idea that Hillel said you can transfer the loan, the lender can transfer the loan to the Beit Din. Once you start talking about corporate entities or non-individual entities, it does complicate things. The same is true with regards to selling chametz. So this day and age, in terms of the corporate mechanism in many types of businesses is the LLC, right? The limited liability corporation. You don't usually have necessarily direct private ownership. So if there is any type of entity involved, it does complicate things. But I think that both of those points will be addressed because we have to now dig a little bit more deeply. Does this still apply? Right? Did Hillel do this? Was this a temporary enactment? Is this something that still lasts? And we're going to see, similar to the idea that Shemitah was not something that was very relevant, especially when Jews are involved in agriculture. Maybe some of the reasons that Shemitah is flexible today would make the canceling of the loans not relevant today, which would make the Prozbul less relevant today. And we're going to see how that plays out also. So, those 2 points, yes, corporate entities complicate things in terms of liability. First, let's see, this year, are our loans actually going to be canceled from a halachic perspective? And we're going to see different approaches to that. Okay, so let's look into some of the Talmudic discussion, source number 2. And as I mentioned, the Prozbul is discussed in the tractate Gittin. Taught in a Braita, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says, the verse states that the context of the cancellation of debts, and this is the manner of the abrogation, he shall abrogate. The loan is canceled. The verse speaks of 2 types of abrogation. One is the release of land, and one is the abrogation of monetary debts. Right? This is the idea that the land is fallow and the debts are being canceled. Since the two are equated, one can learn the following. At a time when you release the land and when the Jubilee year is practiced, you abrogate monetary debts. At a time when you do not release the land, such as the present time when the Jubilee year is no longer practiced, you also don't abrogate monetary debts. Here, the Talmud is doing something which is very relevant in all aspects of Shemitah. Is Shemitah today a biblical law? The Torah presents Shemitah, but maybe the Torah only obligates the Shemitah as a Torah obligation when all of the listings of the commandments relating to it are enforced, including the Jubilee year. Right, you have 7 years, 7th year is a sabbatical year. 7 cycles of 7 years, the 50th year is the Jubilee year. Jubilee year only is relevant in times when all the Jews are living in their land. There's no Jubilee anymore. If there's no Jubilee anymore, maybe the Shemitah falls off. And if Shemitah falls off, maybe cancellation of debts falls off. So what exactly is going on? Is there even still cancellation of debts? And the sages instituted that despite this, the sabbatical year will abrogate debt in the present in remembrance of the Torah mandated sabbatical year. Right, so, okay, that it could be that there's no longer a Torah obligation, but the rabbi said we're still going to practice Shemitah so that we don't forget what Shemitah is. Right, in remembrance of the Torah mandated year. Hillel saw that the people of the nation refrained from lending each other, so he rose and instituted the Prozbul. According to this explanation, the ordinance of Hillel did not conflict with the Torah law, but rather he added an ordinance account to the effect of a rabbinic law. Right, so let's you say, oh, Hillel is a legal fiction. You're allowed to do something like that when it's regulating a rabbinic law in the first place. Since the cancellation of debts is only a rabbinic enactment, well, once you're making rabbinic enactments, you could also find a workaround for this rabbinic enactment. So this sets off, again, just because something is rabbinic doesn't mean it's not unimportant, right? I'm a very strong believer that what Rabbi says is very, very important. But here, it is not the same as its initial obligation, its initial Torah presentation, but still, the Rabbi said that the Shemitah and the canceling of debts is still in effect, and Hillel modified that rabbinic enactment. Source number 3. A dilemma was raised before the sages. When Hillel instituted the Prozbul, was it for his generation and the custom developed to continue it, or did he perhaps institute for all generations, right? Should there still be a Prozbul? It's just interesting that some of the things that make their way trickle down from the Talmud into practice, it's not so clear that they were initially meant to be forever black and white enactments without any type of differentiation. We see this in different areas of Jewish law, and can sometimes lead to, some of the differences in how things are applied. So Gemara asks, what difference is there if it was for his generation, for other or for all generations, right? It's still in use. The Gemara explains the differences arise with regard to nullifying the institution of Prozbul. If you say that Hillel made Prozbul for his generation alone, and that he instituted it for, then we can nullify it if we desire. But if you say it's for all generations, then there's a principle that a court cannot nullify the action of another court only if it is greater than it in wisdom and number, right? This is how the rabbis protect rabbinic enactments, right? Why you might be thinking, if the rabbi said something, why can't later rabbis change it? Because if the rabbis enacted something in the period of the Talmud to be applied for all generations, then later generations are not able to overturn it. So Hillel as well, did he set it up and then just leave it, and then it's for us and later generations of rabbis to reinterpret it, or did Hillel make a decree that the rabbis then accepted that can never be overturned? Just raising the question, however, does point to some flexibility, right? There are some, it could be one way, it could be the other way. So it shows that there may be a difference of opinion as to whether the enactment of Hillel of this Prozbul, this workaround to still be able to collect the loans, is that something that's forever, or did he put it out there with the possibility of it being amended or rolled back in future generations? And again, even if the Talmud is thinking that it's there forever, the very fact that it's entertaining this possibility, this indicates that there could be some wiggle room in the Prozbul. Next source number 4. Come in here, that which Shmuel said, right? This is a very famous way of starting a teaching of the Talmud. Tashma, come in here. And just, as an interesting side note, people, if you look at the Zohar, the major work for Jewish mysticism, it also is written very much in the style of Talmudic literature, right? It's in the Aramaic, same rabbis, but very often the Zohar, when it wants to start a conversation, says tachazeh, come and look. Kind of the difference between the more intellectual content of the Talmud versus the more visionary or imaginative content of Jewish mysticism. Anyway, come in here. That which Shmuel said, the Prozbul is an ulbana of the judges. An ulbana means it's kind of shameful. This is an outrage. If my strength increases, I will nullify. So we here have one of the major Amoraim, rabbis of the Talmud, saying he wants to nullify it. Gemara challenges this. How can Shmuel say I will nullify it? Isn't it a case that your court can't nullify the action of another court only if it's greater than wisdom in number? Who is Shmuel, right? Proceeding down with the idea that Hillel made this decree and it's not meant to be, it's a permanent decree. Why can Shmuel say, why would he even think he would nullify it? It must be that Shmuel holds that Hillel did not establish the Prozbul for all generations, and in his time, it carried the force of a mere custom. So there's clearly a strand of rabbinic thought that Shmuel felt that Hillel did not make this decree forever, and therefore Shmuel is interested in saying that if I had the ability, if I had the agreement, if I had the platform, I would annul it. Gemara rejects this proof. It can be explained that this is what he said. If my strength increases so that I become greater than Hillel, then I will nullify the Prozbul. Now, people are uncomfortable with that. Meaning, as if Shmuel is willing to say that Hillel's decree was not for all generations, that kind of undermines the foundation of Prozbul. Again, even if Shmuel's in the minority, the very fact that that's being entertained would indicate that Hillel's enactment is not meant to be lasting forever. It's a little bit weaker. By contrast, Rav Nachman said, if my strength increases, I will uphold the institution of the Prozbul. Gemara says, what does he mean he's going to uphold it? Right? Isn't it here? Like, what are you saying? I support keeping Shabbos. I'm going to institute Shabbos. Shabbos is already there. Prozbul's already there. What's Rav Nachman saying? Right? Why does the Prozbul require further support? The Gemara explained. This is what Rav Nachman said. If my strength increases, I will say something about it, and I will institute that even though the Prozbul was not written, it is considered as though it is written. Then people who no longer need to write the Prozbul will be considered as if everyone wrote one. So here we have the view of Rabbi Nachman, who would like to say the following. I would like there to be a rule that a Prozbul should be assumed to be written on everyone's behalf. Any lender is already having a Prozbul, and then people don't even have to write one. It would be considered as everyone wrote one. Well, if Rabbi Nachman's position is carried forward, what would that indicate? What would that mean for lenders nowadays? Well, if Rabbi Nachman had his way, lenders don't need Prozbul anymore. Why not? It's as if they're already written. Right? It's kind of like a blanket statement, right? The idea that it's almost as it's an unwritten rule that nowadays Rabbi Nachman wishes or can envision a situation that Prozbul isn't needed because it's assumed to already be being instituted and in place. Now, this is a bold statement, but it also would mean that Rav Nachman envisions a situation that Prozbul doesn't have to be written. So if we would have a lender and a borrower, and now it's the Shemitah year and the loan's about to be canceled, based on Rabbi Nachman's position, he envisions the possibility. Again, he does say that it requires if my strength increases. Rabbi Nachman envisions the possibility of a Prozbul being assumed or presumed as being in place already without it actually being written. And this, is kind of a very big deal. It's kind of, we don't have blanket measures that let it be as if I daven this morning, even if I don't daven this morning, right? Again, it's probably not a good example because davening requires an articulation, enunciation of words. But essentially, in this case, Rabbi Nachman is saying, let it assume to be written. And to try and understand the reasoning of Rabbi Nachman, some of the commentators say, well, the fact that he's willing to say this and say that it's as if the Prozbul is written and the loans are not canceled, seems to indicate that Rav Nachman feels that the cancellation of debts in this time may be something that's a little bit weaker. And the idea that he's willing to say that the debt is not canceled without writing the Prozbul because it says if the Prozbul is written, that indicates that we're not really following the cancellation of loans anymore. Going back to that first source, the idea that the whole concept of Shemitah is weakened in our time. So guess what? Loans are, according to the letter of the law, in its optimal form, loans are canceled. That's not the case today. Hill instituted a Prozbul so that there has to be positive actions to keep the loans in place. You know what? Shemitah is so weak nowadays. Let's just assume the Prozbul is written and the Prozbul can be collected. That's what Rabbi Nachman wants to suggest. Again, doesn't necessarily mean that everyone agreed with it, but the very fact that Rav Nachman, whose opinion is recorded in the Talmud, is the idea that that the loans can be collected even if the Prozbul isn't written, because we could assume as if it was written, or therefore indicate that maybe the cancellation of debts as well as the need for a Prozbul may be weaker than we initially thought. Questions or comments before we look at some of the practical halacha as understood by some of the major codifiers of this discussion. Remember, so far we looked at the presentation, we looked at some of the Talmudic conversation. How does this get implemented and applied? Okay, so the Rambam, Maimonides, source number 5, when he's talking about the Prozbul, he says that only the greatest sages, like the court of Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi, may write a Prozbul, for they are worthy of extracting the money of the people, but other courts may not write. If that's what the Rambam says, what does that do to Prozbul? If only those types of courts could write the Prozbul, could invoke the Prozbul, what would that say about courts today? They don't really have that ability to write Prozbul. So what about loans? So some understand the Rambam is saying that maybe Prozbul, works at a time that you have such great courts, or you have, courts that have more acceptance. But if you don't have those courts, maybe the cancellation of debts is no longer applicable. Maybe the only reason the Rambam is saying this is because he will say Prozbul is something that Hillel instituted. Maybe the Rambam is following kind of the approach of Rabbi Nachman. Let's assume that Prozbul is written. We don't live in pristine sabbatical year times where we follow the laws, the agricultural laws, and the cancellation of the loans in its entirety. So if we're going to have Prozbul, which Hillel instituted, and it's an important concept, that's great. But we're not going to, we can only do that if we have those types of batei din, those rabbinical courts. Otherwise, no Prozbul, the loans can be, we're not going to cancel the loans either. But it's a nice idea, so we're going to keep it. The idea of Prozbul. But if you can't do it right, don't do it at all. And maybe the loans are not canceled. That's one way of understanding the Rambam. The Shulchan Aruch, when it talks about this idea of the cancellation of loans in source number 6, it's in the Hebrew, and I'll translate it into the English, says that Shemitah ksafim, ein Shemitah ksafim noheges min haTorah ela b'zman sheyovel noheg. The cancellation of all loans, of all debts, is only biblically in play when there's a Jubilee year. When there's no Jubilee year, right, it's rabbinic. And that's nowadays everything is, it's all rabbinic. So the Shulchan Aruch is saying, look, we don't have the full observance of Shemitah, both agricultural and in particular when it comes to cancellation of loans. Haga, this is the comment of the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isilis, the Ashkenazi approach to this. Kenu Askamas Kol HaPoskim, this is the majority view. However, Yesh Omrim De'ein Shemitah Noheges Bizman Hazeh. Some say there's no sabbatical year at all, right? We don't have it anymore. Ein Shemitah, Ein Noagin and Shemitah Klal Bizman Hazeh. We don't, many in these countries relied upon the idea that there is no Shemitah anymore. It just doesn't exist. And this was still, this was definitely in place in the times of the Rush. Was Rosh Rabbeinu Asher, 14th century, was very upset that people were not following Shemitah. He was upset that people weren't following Shemitah because he disagreed strongly with this view. However, the Ramah is saying there is a very strong view that nowadays there's no Shemitah. The laws of Shemitah do not apply. And so the Ramah introduces this idea. He actually talks about which year would be the Shemitah year. He quotes the year. He quotes the idea, the year 4767. 4367. Back in his time, he tries to calculate the Shemitah years. But he says, "Yiratzon sheibane beis hamikdash v'chasru azlin no Shemitah v'yovlin right kiyavo Shiloh." Right, he hopes that when Mashiach comes, we'll get back on track. So we have that there seemed to be, the idea of Shemitah being rabbinic seems to be a very widespread view. The Ramah then states that Shemitah not applying at all was a well-established view. It was a controversial view, but it was a well-established view. Rabbeinu Asher was very against that view. But that does seem to be, the Ramah states, the approach that many had, that there's no Shemitah. Why was he saying there's no Shemitah? He's living in Poland. The idea that it seems that no one was writing Prozbuls. The idea of the Prozbul does not seem to have a lot of, be a very widespread practice. And therefore, if the loans are canceled in the Shemitah year and you need the Prozbul, how come there's no Prozbul? And so the Ramah basically says there must have been entrenched this view that there's no Shemitah anymore. None of the laws of Shemitah agriculturally or when it comes to lending, there's no Shemitah anymore. Shemitah only worked when there's a Jubilee year, and therefore that trickled down into the culture, into the halachic practice. Now, this view would also be if there's no Shemitah even agriculturally, this would seem to further permit to be the leniencies that many employ in terms of the heter mechira and the like when it comes to land. But we're now talking just about the loans. But so again, Shemitah being rabbinic, many people can buy into. Shemitah not even applying today, more controversial, but many did seem to buy into it. It does seem to have shaped the practice of there not being a Prozbul. Historically speaking, the Prozbul was not something that seemed to be widespread, and we'll have to try and understand why and what happened to it. But for example, the Shulchan Aruch Harav, which was written by Rabbi Shneir Zalman of Ladi, the first Rebbe of Chabad, source number 7, he just points out, Achshav lo nagu Prozbul b'medinos elu. It's not the practice. It's not being done. Now he says, in the end, Kol Yirei Shemayim Yachmir Liatzmo Lasas Prozbul Shudav Hashem Bo Hefsid B'Kal L'Taken. Right? He says you should do it because it's not a big deal. It's very easy. The little document that says I give my loans to the Bezdin. But it does seem to have been fallen out of practice. Rabbi Shlomo Luria also, writing in the 16th, 17th century period, Mishum Hachin Yizbatel Prozbul. Prozbul has been nullified, has disappeared. Why? Because it seems that this idea of Shemitah potentially not applying today had caught on. Did it catch on? Did it catch on because they were living outside the land? Very possibly. But that probably reinforced the fact that people were not we're not doing the Prozbul. They're not keeping Shemitah at all, but it clearly, the Ramah pointing out the fact that this view that Shemitah is no longer applicable must be valid. How can it be possible that Shemitah is no longer as valid or Prozbul is no longer necessary? Because we saw already in the Talmud that there was some disagreement as to the binding nature of the cancellation of the loans and the role of Hillel's Prozbul. So, now we get to a bit of a question, practically speaking, it touches upon Howard's point. What happens if you don't have a Prozbul? And so the Shemitah year ends, it's after you lent $1,000 during the Shemitah year, and now it's 5783, and you have no Prozbul, what can you do? So Rabbi Moshe Feinstein addressed the question in the source number 9. And you can see the first line, B'shachach la'asos Prozbul im rashar l'kofo l'shalim b'mdinoseinu. Bizman hazeh. Let's say you forget the Prozbul, can you still force the borrower to repay? And he points out a few things. He says, look, the loans are canceled, but it's still nice of the borrower to repay the lender. Right? Even if the borrower no longer is obligated to repay the lender, it's still a nice thing to do because, let's face it, society works much better when people are, trying to get along. So he points to that. That's first. That's first thing. That's the first thing you need to know. Then this is now the fourth line. He says that Shemitah nowadays. Right? We saw that there were places, he's invoking the Ramah, that people didn't practice Shemitah anymore. No Shemitah, no Prozbul. And he says, even though, this is now the fifth line, 5 words in, and even if people were writing Prozbul, even if you would say some people were writing the Prozbul, so that this should mean that if the borrower doesn't have a Prozbul, the lender now is off the hook. Just because people had a Prozbul didn't mean they had to. The only reason they had to is because the only reason people would write Prozbul throughout the generations is not because it's an obligation, but inyan kali, right? It's a nice idea, right? Maintaining a connection, the vestiges of Shemitah, connection to our land, that's a great thing. So the fact that many rabbis were telling you to write a Prozbul isn't necessarily because you have to, it's because it's a nice thing to. And so therefore, maybe if the lender does not have a Prozbul, the borrower still has to pay back. So therefore, he says that we have a long tradition in both Ashkenaz and Sfarad of them not canceling loans, and they would collect loans. And so therefore, why should we be more strict than those views that we saw earlier in source number 6 of the Ramah, that people were not practicing the cancellation of loans and people were not practicing Prozbul? So he concludes, Al kol panim lamasa tzrichim halovim l'shalem. He says borrowers have to pay. And let's say the lender takes the borrower to Bezdin, and Bezdin says, guess what? Shemitah, cancel the loan, you don't owe it anymore. Basically, he can take the matter into his own hands and he can sue him in secular court, where Moshe Feinstein says. Because we can follow the view that the Shemitah year is not canceling the loan, and even though normally we would not allow 2 Jews to adjudicate a non-Jewish court, he'd be able to do so here because the Jewish court is acting improperly, which is a pretty big deal to be said, right? The prohibition of Jews adjudicating in a non-Jewish court is very serious. The fact that we don't do it as much these days has much more to do with the fact that we've been in exile for so long, more than there's no Beit Din. There certainly are Jewish courts that can help adjudicate all sorts of complex legal issues, corporate issues, etc. Right? The Beis Din of America, in particular, adjudicates billion-dollar situations, disagreements between people. They basically look at it more as binding arbitration, bring in the experts, have the rabbis part of the conversation, right? But going to non-Jewish court is viewed as a terrible violation of Jewish law. And here Rabbi Feinstein is saying, guess what? if the borrower can't find any recourse in a Beit Din that will recognize the fact that A, loans may not be canceled anymore, or B, the Prozbul is no longer as much necessary anymore, take the guy to court, right? That's like the old people's court, right? You can't get him to, you take him to court. So take him to court, and which is a pretty big deal for Rabbi Moshe Feinstein to suggest. So we have, Rabbi Feinstein saying in the realm of the practical, the idea of the loans being canceled is to say the loans are not canceled is viable, and to say Prozbul is not necessary is also reasonable. So how did the Prozbul come back onto the scene? So it really in the 17th century, the rabbis started to encourage it. Rabbi Yonasan Eibschitz in particular, it's mentioned in source number 10. He's the one who invokes the idea that, come on, we really want to have a connection to Shemitah and a connection to the land, right? The Jews were punished, were exiled for not having this connection. If we want to get back to our land, we should try to restore our connection to Shemitah. It also certainly became something that when Jews started returning and creating agricultural settlements in the land, in the end of the 19th century, this was something that became relevant, and the question was asked, and the issue was once again revived. And it is possible that once the issue is being revived, maybe most of these sources that are recognizing that Shemitah is no longer as binding, or Prozbul, or loans are not canceled, or Prozbul isn't required. Where were these conversations taking place? Outside the land of Israel. So once you're back in the land of Israel, and it becomes a relevant question again about agriculture, and it becomes a relevant question again about commerce, what you may end up doing is reviving something, even if practically speaking, and there is enough halachic consensus, as Rabbi Moshe Feinstein points out, that the Shemitah year no longer has to cancel the loans. Prozbul isn't required. What's the big deal? Have a Prozbul. What's the big deal? Let's revive some of the more some of the views that the sabbatical year is more binding. What's the harm, right? That's where the heter mechir of the land comes from. That's where the reinstitution or the strengthening of the institution of the Prozbul comes from. Shlomo Brody, who is an author and a teacher, now the executive director of the Halachic Organ Donor Society, has an article on the Prozbul, and he talks about that as these questions became relevant once more practically, and you start going to the sources, it's not unusual to revive the positions that they were before you left the land. He invokes Rabbi Dr. Chaim Soloveitchik's article about rupture and reconstruction that tries to address the fact that there seems to be more stringencies in today's Orthodox world. And his basic thesis is that if you try and revive Jewish life after the Holocaust, where you no longer have a mimetic tradition, the ability to just follow what your ancestors did, and you're trying to revive it by looking back in the texts, then of course you're going to revive it based on the letter of the law and not just how things were implemented. So for generations and generations, for hundreds of years, the Jews were outside of Israel. We know what the opinions that kept Shemitah relevant in the cancellation of the cancellation of loans. We know that what those sources are. They just wasn't being practiced. So maybe we began to gravitate towards those views that were more lenient and did not apply the strength of the sabbatical year to being binding. But now that we're back in the land and it becomes actually a relevant question, it's not so. It's not such a hop, skip, and a jump. It's not such a big jump to start reviving the letter of the law as it pertains, as if we're following the tradition of actually following it. And so he says that there definitely were the rabbis who remain more lenient in terms of even applying Shemitah today, right? The Rabbi Moshe Isserlis's view would seem to be able to apply to Shemitah today, even in Israel. But there were those who felt, look, it's not a bad thing to keep Shemitah. It's not a bad thing to have a Prozbul. It's a nice thing to be connected to the land. If it's possible, then it should be restored. Certainly easier when it comes to Prozbul than it is to the agricultural laws, but it's a similar approach. Many will point to Rabbi Avram Yeshaya Karelitz, known as the Chazon Ish. He was born in Lithuania, came to Israel in the 1930s, and became really the spiritual leader of what becomes the Israeli Haredi community, right, centered in Bnei Brak. he revived the focus on the laws of the land, the laws of Shemitah, and was the leading voice in restoring it to as pristine as it should be in terms of agriculture and in terms of Prozbul. The other thing about Prozbul is that it's very easy. That was something that we saw the Shulchan Aruch Harav, right? Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Ladi, the Alter Rebbe pointed out his Shulchan Aruch, right? You can go to Chabad.org and fill out a Prozbul online, right? So Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Ladi says it's so pretty easy, and his followers have made it even easier by just clicking a button online. Not everyone is as lenient when it comes to that being a valid Prozbul. Beis Din of America has a document that's supposed to be filled out and returned to them. Still pretty simple, but does require a little bit of work. And some of these differences also indicate the fact that if it's as easy as this, then there's probably, it's because we're not as concerned for this issue. And look, we have the Rama, we have Rabbi Moshe Feinstein going as far as saying you can sue the lender, you can sue the borrower in secular court to collect your loan after Shemitah year. Does indicate that, any of our Prozbul activities are there to try and reconnect to what was, rather than being absolutely binding, until such a time when Shemitah becomes as binding as it used to be, and then we may have to take all of these things a little bit more seriously. So take a look out for where to fill out your Prozbul or don't. But this is certainly an interesting. It was a unique enactment of Hillel in the first place, accepted to different various degrees throughout Talmudic literature. Halachic literature applied into the mainstream at various degrees. Seems to be very little applied in the mainstream, where rabbis suggested it be more so. And only in the last 140 years or so, as it became more and more relevant, did it become more and more focused and more focus on it to do it. And especially now when it's so easy to be done, it's probably, it's no skin off your nose to do it, that the rabbis have really made a much bigger deal of it in this day and age. So Prozbul Buti.